So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Alejandro Sanchez. I'm a campaigns officer at the National Secular Society. So I'll be giving you a brief outline of the secular argument against religious ritual circumcision and a brief update on what we're up to and what we're doing about it. So when I tell my friends that I've just started work at the National Secular Society, I'm often met with slightly mystified expressions. So we as an organization have a lot of work to do on explaining to the public what secularism actually is. But in its simplest terms, secularism is the idea that everyone in society should be treated equally regardless of religion or lack thereof. So what does this have to do with circumcision? Well, last month over Zoom, David introduced me to the metaphor of the three-legged stool. Undermine any of these three interdependent legs and the whole edifice, circumcision in this case, comes crashing down. So the work 50 Square are doing in writing medical ignorance about circumcision is absolutely vital. I can certainly testify that during my 5 years at med school, there was only the most fleeting references to the foreskin, and I was certainly not educated about its many important functions. Just by way of example, I would wager that many of my med school colleagues would be extremely surprised to learn that the foreskin is actually anatomically attached to the head of the penis and it only naturally separates over time. So while 15 Square are quite rightly taking aim at the medical leg of the stool, we at the NSS are chipping away at the religious leg. And I should say that whenever I use the term circumcision in this talk, it's shorthand for non-therapeutic male infant circumcision. Let me begin by setting out the state of the law on circumcision in England and Wales. I'll also borrow heavily on the work of James Chegwidden. He's a barrister at Old Square Chambers. He gave an excellent talk at our 2018 Healthcare and Secularism conference. The link is in the presentation, so if you haven't seen it already, I can thoroughly recommend that. And it's worth saying that James, as well as a barrister, is also a curate at St. Cuthbert's Church in Earl's Court. So it's certainly proof, or he is certainly proof, that one can be religious and oppose religious circumcision. The leading case in this field is the Crown versus Brown. This was heard before the Law Lords, which preceded the Supreme Court in 1993. So the case famously involved a group of 5 sadomasochists who had engaged in sexual acts involving bodily harm. And without inflicting the gory details upon you, the Law Lords held that the consent of Party A cannot be used as a defense to Party B inflicting bodily harm upon them. So if you were to commit an act against me, even if I consented to it, you could still be prosecuted under the Offences Against the Person Act 1861. Question the wisdom of that decision as you will, that is where the law stands. But perhaps there are religious or cultural exemptions to this ruling. So I'd like to borrow 2 cases from James which seek to disprove this. So the first, R versus Adesanya from 1974. So a mother from the Yoruba ethnic group in Nigeria living here in the UK used a razor blade to make incisions in the cheeks of her 9 and 14-year-old sons. The sons were both willing to submit themselves to the procedure. Nevertheless, the mother was brought before the Old Bailey. She pled she had merely been following her Nigerian tribal tradition. However, her plea fell on deaf ears and she was convicted of occasioning actual bodily harm. The second case, which was reported in The Guardian here, is that of R versus Zaidi. This is from 2008, and it centers around the self-flagellation ceremony in Shia Islam known as Ashura, which celebrates the martyrdom of one of Muhammad's grandsons. So Mr. Zaidi brought his 2 sons, aged 13 and 15, to a local community center. They initially agreed to participate in the ritual, and they had done so since the age of 6 in their native Pakistan. However, Zaidi argued before the court that this rite was a part of his faith, but he was nonetheless found guilty of child cruelty. So there is no religious exemption from wounding. So that, you might think, would prove the death knell for religious male infant circumcision in the UK. So if even consenting individuals cannot legally submit themselves to harmful religious practices, surely infants, who are even more vulnerable, would be protected under the law. That to me is the irresistible conclusion that one is drawn to. And yet religious male circumcision continues to enjoy a presumed exemption from the law of wounding. And the absurdity of this state of affairs is highlighted in the Tattooing of the Minors Act 1969, which prohibits a parent from tattooing their child when they're under the age of 18. And I'm not usually one to draw on the wisdom of the comment section from YouTube, but underneath James's video, one commentator summed up the unusual and absurd state of the law in the UK. So it is crazy that it is illegal to tattoo a child's foreskin, but considered legal to cut that same foreskin off. So that is where we are here. And even the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child have said that traditional male circumcision may constitute a harmful practice. And certainly one of our goals at the NSS is to elicit what's called a general comment from the UNCRC. And that would allow us to much more effectively make the argument that the practice constitutes an international human rights violation. One other anomalous feature of circumcision's legal status here in the UK was this case called Re B&G from 2015. So this was heard in the family division. Sir James Munby was presiding. He was the president of the family division, and one of the most senior judges in the UK at the time. And what did he say? He said that male circumcision constitutes significant harm under the Children Act 1989, and he said that it was more invasive than some forms of FGM, such as clitoral hood nicking. However, he sought to differentiate the two practices by opining that circumcision provides hygienic benefits. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here on this point, so I'll say no more about that. He also made the unsubstantiated claim that FGM has no basis in religion. What I'd say to this is, firstly, it's untrue. So just one counterexample is that in 2009, the National Council of Islamic Religious Affairs in Malaysia issued a fatwa mandating clitoral hood nicking. And secondly, even if it were true that FGM has no basis in religion, why should this alone serve to render it impermissible? This is exactly the sort of religious privilege that the National Secular Society seeks to combat. And as anyone who has seen the documentary American Circumcision will know, the American Academy of Pediatrics very briefly demonstrated a modicum of intellectual and ethical consistency by arguing that as male circumcision is more extensive than some forms of FGM, and male circumcision is legal, then so too those less harmful, to use their words, forms of FGM should be legal too. Yet, in the face of volcanic blowback, they quickly rode back on this politically suicidal position. But it's exactly this outrage that FGM engenders that we need to cultivate in opposition to male circumcision. It deserves exactly the same disapprobation and contempt. But even otherwise rational people can be deceived by the supposed distinction between FGM and male circumcision. And Sam Harris, who I'm sure some of you are familiar with, he was one of the foremost new atheists in the early 2000s, and he now hosts the Making Sense podcast, which has a listenership of over 1 million per episode. His permissive attitude to male circumcision, given that he usually gives religion no quarter, still shocks me.
My position on male circumcision, I've been strangely quiet on this topic, apparently. Maybe the fact that I'm a circumcised male has something to do with that. I think the analogy that people draw between male and female circumcision is a deeply unhelpful one. It does a lot to minimize the horror of what is happening to little girls throughout this world. There really is no analogy to draw there. I can't say that I'm a supporter of male circumcision. I don't think I would have circumcised a boy had we had one, nor can I say that I've paid some price, psychological or otherwise, for having been circumcised. So I think it's much less of an issue for me, though I do share Hitch's bewilderment at the fact that anyone thought this was an important thing to do to little boys. And my bias is certainly to be against it at this point, because it really is, apart from some tenuous health claims, it does seem to be a practice almost entirely anchored to religion. But don't be misled here. What girls are going through in countries like Somalia and Egypt bears no relation to the circumcision of boys And it's very important to keep that straight in one's head.
So to me, it's clear that the outrage against FGM and circumcision need not be a zero-sum game. So to that end, I'm working with Dr. Brian Earp, who is an academic in this field, perhaps some of you have heard of him, to try and convince Sam Harris to host Brian on the podcast so they can have a debate on the topic. Because I think before the law will change, we need to change societal attitudes. It's not all doom and gloom, however. There are some big names that support our cause. Joe Rogan, who some of you may have heard of, he hosts the most listened to podcast in the world. I think he has an 11 million audience per episode, is a passionate opponent of circumcision. So it's good to have the world's most influential podcaster on side. So leaving behind the law and popular culture for the moment, let's turn to what some of Britain's medical bodies have to say about non-therapeutic circumcision. The BMA's 2019 guidance states that male infant circumcision does not require a medical professional. As one anonymous reviewer of this draft guidance said, this was an astonishing assertion. And I wrote to the BMA last month asking them to explain this position. And their head of medical ethics, Veronica English, wrote back, and she says this reflects the legal position. But given that the BMA is a medical organization, I think we can agree that this guidance requires clarification. The guidance also says that therapeutic circumcision should only be used where less invasive options such as steroid creams or stretching or preputioplasty would be ineffective. And that's a sound piece of advice. But there is one exception to this rule, they say. If the parent in such a case happens to have a relevant social or cultural interest in having the child circumcised, then it would be permitted. So the BMA guidance has somehow contorted itself into creating a non-therapeutic rationale for a therapeutic circumcision. And this doublethink is what Antony Lempert, who is the head of our secular medical forum, calls Schrodinger's ethics. And that same phenomenon applies to the 2008 guidance issued by the then Chief Medical Officer of Scotland, Sir Harry Burns. So there had been an increasing demand in Scotland for religious circumcision to be provided on the NHS. And it was decided that there would a dedicated pathway would be drawn up to service that need. But there were some very strict requirements. So religious circumcision would only be provided on the NHS if it was carried out under a general anesthetic, and so that the child might more safely tolerate that anesthetic, they would have to be at least 6 months old. It would have to be carried out by a specialist pediatric surgeon in a specialist pediatric centre. So the Royal Hospital for Sick Children, Glasgow, says general anesthetic is necessary because it is safer and less painful for your child. And so the only logical extrapolation from this statement is that those religious circumcisions provided outside of the NHS without a general anesthetic are therefore less safe and more painful. And I wrote to the Chief Medical Officer of Scotland asking him to explain this discrepancy, but he refused to engage. And we've also tried to engage with the GMC, as I believe you here at 15 Square have as well, to equally frustrating effect. And Dr. Antony Lempert was told repeatedly by them, you have no idea how offended the Chief Rabbi would be if we were to change our guidance. So yes, the GMC has a statutory duty under the Medical Act 1983 to promote and maintain the health, safety, and well-being of the public. It does not have a statutory duty to keep the Chief Rabbi happy. There are, however, some willing to speak up, even if they are not fully aligned with our goals. So I recently discovered the story of this whistleblower, Mr. Shaban Ahmed, who himself carries out non-therapeutic circumcision. So he is a pediatric surgeon at Alder Hey, or at least he was back in 2014 when this article was written. And he's fought for over a decade to get the Care Quality Commission to clamp down on dangerous non-therapeutic practice carried out by medical professionals in the field of circumcision. And in 2014, he compiled a dossier of 22 cases, which he sent to the CQC. So allow me to read some lowlights from his dossier. He writes, in some cases, boys aged 6 to 10 are tied to tables or forcibly held down while a local anesthetic is injected directly into the penis. The anesthetic often proves ineffective and the operation follows with the child still screaming in pain. Bear in mind, this is here in the UK. Some young patients nearly died after circumcisions, and Mr. Ahmed recalls having to remove part of a boy's penis in order to save it. Others lost so much blood they needed intensive care. But perhaps the most shocking incident of all was this. 2 surgery receptionists told Mr. Ahmed how a boy undergoing circumcision ran screaming to a lavatory, locked himself in, bleeding heavily. The child's father fainted and pandemonium broke loose. As Mr. Ahmed puts it, how such barbaric and amateurish standards of care have been permitted beggars belief. And I was surprised that there was no media follow-up to this story back in 2014. So I've written to one of the journalists, Tim Raymond from The Times, who co-authored that article. And he's very generously offered to put me in touch with Mr. Ahmed. So I've sent a message on to him and hoping to hear back shortly, as well as from the CQC. And just in case there was any doubt about the dangers of ritual circumcision, this is the result of a Freedom of Information request, which I'm sure some of you have seen, sent to Birmingham Children's Hospital back in 2011. And it shows that in 2011 alone, 11 boys aged 0 to 1 were admitted for life-threatening hemorrhage, shock, or sepsis following circumcision. So I will end by just giving you an update on my most recent piece of campaign work. So if any of you are Emmerdale fans, you will know that recently a character in the show, Faith Dingle, ended her life via assisted suicide. This was because she had intractable pain due to a cancer diagnosis. And the Emmerdale writers reached out to a campaign group called Dignity in Dying, who campaigned for assisted dying legal reform here in the UK. And they asked for help with scripting and personal testimonies and any research that they could offer. And I'm hoping to engineer a similar plot line for circumcision. And I'm not an avid soap watcher, so if any of you know a suitable show or character or story arc where that might work, please do let me know. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for your time. And if there are any questions, fire away.